Hello, everyone, and welcome to another video pre-concert talk. We're so glad you're joining us. It is currently, for us, the three of us, it's almost exactly 1 week before the concert. It's a Saturday evening. And I'm Amanda Dykhouse. I'm joined by our conductor, Johannes, who is currently in Long Beach, California, and our bass soloist for this upcoming concert, Jack Unzicker, who is currently in Arlington, Texas. And I suppose I should let all of you know, just in the interest of full disclosure, that Jack is my brother-in-law, so I could arm twist him into joining us, and we're glad he's here. So we thought while Jack was here, we would start by talking about the piece that he's going to play. So Jack, who is this Nino Rota guy, and why should we care about him, and why did you pick that piece?
Okay, well, hello everyone. Very much looking forward to playing with the Holland Symphony and the Jack Miller Performing Arts Center. It's going to be absolutely wonderful to be on that stage and hear the orchestra there. So Nino Rota was an Italian composer from the 20th century. He's best known as a film composer, although he wrote hundreds of opera, ballet, theater, chamber music, vocal music, orchestral music. But he's best known in the US probably as the composer for the music for the Godfather movies, the first and second Godfather movies. But he wrote music for over 150 films, a lot of big name Italian filmmakers like Fellini yeah, so this is a wonderful piece for double bass and orchestra. It's a very large concerto. It's 4 movements long, or right around 30 minutes, and has all kinds of really beautiful characters and different moods and exciting things. And it's a very humorous piece. It's got a lot of sarcasm. It has a lot of elements of Prokofiev to it, if you are familiar with his works. And yeah, it's been a real pleasure to learn this piece. It's the first time that I've learned this and prepared it to perform.
So do you think it sounds like movie music?
Uh, I don't, I wouldn't. One of the things that's interesting about movie music is that it would basically, if you took my part out, like kind of the lead dominating voice, that would actually be what you're looking at, as the film would replace that. So if you rehearse this piece without me there and then put something up on the screen, it might sound like movie music, right? Um, but I wouldn't say no. I don't think it sounds like movie music. I think it sounds like concert music to
Okay.
me.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And about choosing the piece, I would actually have to throw that back to the Holland Symphony, because I was asked if I'd be interested in playing and what would I be interested in playing, and I sent a very long list. So you actually chose the Rota, and I agreed to it. So how did you come up with the Rota?
I think I'm guilty for that. So um, I know some of the bass concertos, and I've always been, sort of like not super excited about them because it's a balance question and it's an orchestration question. The bass doesn't have a super high projection without a microphone, but I found this one to be just brilliantly orchestrated. So the orchestra sort of swells and then diminuendos right before the bass comes in. It's very exciting from an orchestral color standpoint, and I've never done it before. So I was immediately
Great, great. Yeah, me too. I like it more and more every day, and so yeah, it's going to be real exciting to put it together.
And I've enjoyed working on
yeah,
it.
the 150 films that you mentioned. So I looked up how many films John Williams wrote, right?
Hmm.
So the soundtracks, and it's actually less than that. So John Williams is only known for 75, I think, movies, and the output of Nino Rota is like twice as much. So the guy was super,
Yeah.
super busy. And I also learned that the third movement, the lyrical slow one, that actually was a theme for a movie that he sort of abandoned, but then recycled into the bass concerto. So it's directly related to his other output. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, I would be willing to bet that John Williams, the budgets for those films are probably quite a bit more than Nino Rota's. He wrote a lot of music for all the spaghetti westerns that were
Right.
so popular in the middle of the 20th century. I learned a few things about him that I hadn't realized before. His first performed pieces in Paris and Milan he composed when he was 12, an oratorio. So very much a child prodigy, very early training in music, and then went on to teaching at one of the conservatories in Italy until his death in the 70s. Um, I can tell you a little interesting story about the connection to Michigan in this piece. One of my colleagues, Tom Kniffik at Western Michigan University, he studied with Franco Petracchi, who's a very well-known 20th century Italian double bassist and soloist. And Nino Rota wrote this concerto for Petracchi. They were colleagues at the conservatory, and they actually had offices on different floors, but one on top of the other. And so a lot of Petracchi's exercises and teaching and the things that Rota was hearing through the ceiling are in the concerto. And through Tom Kniffik, who studied with Petracchi, he contacted Petracchi, and they actually sent a scan of the original piece that Petracchi was working on with Rota. And it had a lot of notations in Italian and notes from meetings between the composer and the performer. And then our sister-in-law happens to have a PhD in Italian literature and poetry. And so she and I worked together to go through the scans and to translate and try to decipher the notes and so forth. And that was added another deeper element to some of the markings that made it into the score or didn't make it into the score, and references to other of Rota's music and films to try to capture some moods that were in other things that he had written. And yeah, it's been a real fascinating process to jump into this. Yeah.
So I just wonder, technically, I don't know too much about bass technique. It looks very difficult to me. So is it harder than a lot of the other bass music? Are there some unique challenges in this part?
Well, I think playing the bass and playing anything on the bass is challenging. I think playing an open string uh, is it's hard to get a sound out of the instrument. Period. It's hard to get the instrument to the hall. It's hard to travel with the instrument on an airplane. It has it has some unique challenges just because it has so many different styles within the music. It has march-like music, it has funny music, it has virtuoso music, it just has fast passage work. It has some gorgeous lyrical playing, so it demands a lot of versatility from the soloist. But I also agree with you very much that it's really, really a fantastic orchestration, that the texture is cleared out and thin enough most of the time when the soloist is playing that he was very, very helpful for one of the hardest things about being a soloist on the double bass, which is being heard. Yeah.
So
Yeah, always.
Jack, you mentioned traveling with the bass, and you're going to fly here from Texas. How do you fly
This is correct.
how do you fly with an instrument that's the size of a couch?
Well, I have two different flight cases. So the instrument's too large to go in the cabin of the airplane. It always has to go underneath, which is pretty unique for most of the musical instruments, like violins and even cellos. You can buy a seat for a cello. So one of my flight cases is over 7 feet tall. It's this large fiberglass white monstrosity. And so when I show up to the airport with that, it looks like I'm flying with a boat. Like I'm just going to take a boat with me and fly. And then I have another instrument that has a removable neck, and that's the one that I'm going to bring for this trip. And so by taking the neck off, the case becomes much smaller, but it's still large enough that it needs to go underneath the airplane. So first thing I'm going to do when I get to Michigan is put the bass back together, which is an ordeal. You have to get it completely set up again, and so it takes a little bit of time. It's not something where you could do it just so that you could drive a convertible or something like that. Like every time that you leave the house, you can take the bass apart and put it back together. It takes an hour or so. Yeah, but as a bass player, you have to plan everything around the size of the instrument, the car you drive, who's going to pick you up at the airport. You have to get there several hours early to let the TSA do their job and make sure that the instrument's packed up again really safely. And so it's a labor of love.
Well, we're glad you're willing to go through all that work to come and play with us.
Oh, it's going to be absolutely my pleasure and my honor to join you. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us, Jack. I think we're going to excuse Jack, and then Johannes and I will continue to talk about the other two pieces. So we're looking forward to seeing you in a few days.
Yeah, I'll see you in a few days. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Looking forward to it.
So to start the concert, we're going to play another piece by a relatively unknown composer whose name is Samuel Coleridge Taylor. So he was an English composer, although he writes a lot of very American-inspired music. And he is someone who is compared a lot with Dvorak. And he was really inspired by Dvorak, listened to a lot of Dvorak. Dvorak was very popular in England at the turn of the century. And it's sort of interesting. He followed in Dvorak's footsteps. As you heard, if you were with us a month ago, or actually just a few weeks ago, Dvorak spent some time in this country and spent a lot of time listening to the sounds of American music, so spirituals, Native American music. Samuel Coleridge Taylor also spent some time in this country and did the same sort of listening and incorporated the same sorts of melodies into his music. So we have the very lush, late romantic sound of the European composers combined with some of these unique American voices. And so we're excited to do the Hiawatha Suite from the ballet. It's something that is performed very infrequently. We don't know if it's ever been performed in Michigan, certainly not in Holland. Even the music is a little bit rough. They didn't have a full score, so Johannes had to put one of his students to work making a full orchestral score with all the parts written out. Let's see, Samuel Coleridge Taylor was inspired by Longfellow's poem about Hiawatha and wrote several big choral and orchestral works, a trilogy of big works. Those were some of the most often performed choral and orchestral works, about 100 years ago. And they have sort of fallen into obscurity now, but I think now that a lot of orchestras are trying to be more representative of all the people in our country, Samuel Coleridge Taylor is sort of being found again, and we are among those orchestras finding him again and eager to present the music to you. I don't know, Johannes is playing this out in California with this group too, so maybe you've learned some more things about the piece.
Well, it's kind of interesting. There is one recording on YouTube that's from 1922, and that isn't exactly the suite. There are some elements missing, but it's the closest recording to the score, actually. And part of the difficulty as a conductor to judge pieces or to estimate how difficult they might be is, of course, I look at the full score. So for those of you who don't know what that means, a full score is basically everybody's part. So I'm looking at 30 different lines, and I have to be able to read vertically as well as horizontally. And so when that's missing, it's very hard for a conductor to know what's going on. So the parts you can actually buy from like Lux retailer, which is pretty affordable. So it's not a rental piece. But it's very curious that there was no full score. So probably when it was performed, nobody actually bothered to take the time to get one. So one of our students, he's actually an alum now. He works for the Long Beach for the LA music and film industry. I asked him now, how long would this take? So he took basically a month to do it. So I scanned in all the parts, and then he entered part by part into a master score and then produced a full score. And that is really a remarkable project. And we had our first reading here out in California last week with the university orchestra. And I didn't even find one mistake in the full score. So, I mean, he's really, really diligent. And he corrected some of the issues already between parts and score not matching. So it has been almost like a rediscovery process. I do think it's pretty much the California premiere. It will also be the Michigan premiere. I don't find any records of this piece being performed, anywhere recently. And you know what's really interesting about Hiawatha? He was so enthralled by this poem and by what it meant. His son he actually named Hiawatha. So there is kind of that. And also, there's one interesting tidbit about Samuel Coleridge Taylor. He will always be remembered as a better composer than a businessman, because after finishing his Hiawatha Wedding Feast in 1898, he sold the publishing rights for a one-time fee. Now, composers would never do that in modern ages, right? So the score was an immediate hit and sold more than 200,000 copies. And so while it made him famous, the royalties that you get from continued sales and performances went elsewhere. So he later lamented that if I had retained my rights in the Hiawatha music, I should have been a rich man. So he unfortunately died fairly young at age 37 of pneumonia. And so I don't know if having more wealth would have maybe afforded him better medical care. But composers now are of a different breed. They're very careful to not sell their rights.
Yeah, I bet he had many regrets about that. How would you describe the music itself? Does it remind you of anything?
Does it remind me of anything? There is a certain amount of the lyricism that you find in Dvorak. So I found one other orchestra that had performed this, and they paired it with a Dvorak New World Symphony. Now, in my programming, I like to not program likes, but do a little bit more variety. But it's going to be a nice theme for the people who come to our Classics 2 concert and remember Dvorak, right? So there's kind of this American theme. But I would say it is very lyrical. There is a narrative element. I mean, as he was describing poetry, he was trying to paint, American landscape and freedom. The poem talks about the meadows and the hills, and describes American landscape. So there is a lot of openness that's in the sound, that's also present in Dvorak, but it's wonderful lyricism. It's very unique. If I would have heard this, not knowing who would have written this, it would have been very hard to identify.
Mhm. Yeah, I was
Yeah.
first exposed to Samuel Coleridge Taylor many years ago when I was looking for different violin concertos that very advanced students can play. And he wrote a delightful violin concerto. And I had a student play it many, many years ago. So that's when I first learned about him. It sort of reminds me of very early soundtrack music. I mean, if you listen to the recording, and if you go over to the program notes tab, we have a link to the recording, and it's a very scratchy recording. So it has that sort of adds to that like old silent movie soundtrack quality to it. But it's a little bit of that. It's definitely telling a story. The suite was written to. It's actually he wrote a ballet to Hiawatha in 1920, and so this suite has various movements extracted from the ballet. So it's definitely music to tell a story. It's a lot of fun.
What I read is he remarked once that he tried to capture the native simplicity, unaffected expression, and unforced realism. So while you can't really be unaffected and unforced, right, because you have your own style, it is sort of it projects not. It's not very ornamented, I would say, musically. It is very real and very touching, right? It affects you right away emotionally. So there isn't a lot of extra there, right? It's rich and core, I would say.
Yeah, so this concert has two pieces that are relatively unknown to unknown composers. And then we end with Beethoven, which, obviously lots of people know Beethoven and lots of people know his Sixth Symphony. I read a delightful description of this symphony. Someone described it as if Beethoven was a summer retreat coordinator, especially in the first movement, writing music that's so peaceful and so relaxed and calming that it's like as if he was a summer retreat coordinator, sort of forcing people to relax. I don't know if that's a good description or not, but the first movement is certainly, sometimes Beethoven will get really, write melodies and work on developing the melodies and, varying the melodies, changing them. This is different in a way. He starts with this little fragment of a phrase that sort of becomes this little fragment that's repeated over and over and over again. And that may sound almost boring, but what Beethoven does is he has this very expansive harmony and shifts in harmony. So this little idea is repeated several times, and then he modulates to a different key, and it's a very calming. In the first movement has very little dissonance. It's very peaceful. It's it's inviting us to the beauty of nature and the countryside. What else do you want to add, Johannes? I'm talking too much.
No, I like it. You always bring these amazing insights. Now that I think about it, it's true. Like you're almost stepping into a picture frame, right? And the music has already started, right? And so when the first theme comes on, it's like, oh, the music is already in motion, and the listener is sort of just invited to join. It's very different from like an adagio introduction to a sonata form, right? I would say Beethoven's symphonies, and we're on a trajectory to do all 9 symphonies. The only ones that are left that Holland Symphony has not done is 6 and 9. So there is purpose to the programming. I would say there is definitely 2 camps, right? Symphonies 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9 are performed the most and known the most. And then there's 2, 4, 6, and 8 that are not as often heard. And 6 is very special. I mean, there's this whole notion of program music versus absolute music, right? So there's obviously there's obviously a descriptive element to the symphony, and a lot of people speculate that Liszt tone poems and Wagner's big scenes they stem from Beethoven breaking ground with composing a symphony that's based on descriptive elements. And at one point in his score, he wrote, "This is a cuckoo, and this is another bird, and this is the brook," right? So he actually had those references. He dictated to his copyists to put those references in the score. So you actually see that written in these references. I would be sort of careful and not just say that he broke necessarily new ground. Beethoven had a lot of trouble in his life right around this time, right? And so in 1802, he wrote the Heiligenstadt Testament. He was aware of losing his hearing. And also he had an infection on his finger a few years later. So that looked pretty bad. Vienna has been occupied by Napoleon's troops since 1805. And his brother got married, and he was a secretary and businessman, and he sort of got married and moved out of that job. So Beethoven was very distraught, and he moved in the year that he wrote the 5th and 6th symphony. They sort of overlap. He moved 4 times in Vienna, so very restless, right? So if you hear all this turmoil that was going on, you think of Beethoven's Symphony Number 5, but at the same time he was writing 6. Which is really amazing that he could differentiate, compartmentalize as much to do that piece and this piece. So it's really remarkable. He often traveled to the countryside to calm down, sort of like the retreat coordinator that you talked about. He found solace in nature. There are other composers that did that. Brahms spent a lot of time in nature. Mahler did this too. Schubert and Schumann. So this sort of re-energizing, giving him strength, it's something that permeates through Beethoven's life. And so this one you can see as sort of the solace from all the breaking ground with Symphony Number 5 and 7. This is sort of like peace and nature, rejuvenating.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating to me that he basically wrote his 5th symphony and 6th symphony at the same time, or at least there was quite a bit of overlap. It's as if he got all his, nervousness and troubles out in the 5th, and then his 6th was where he turned just to kind of find peace, with himself or with his circumstances. Yeah, I mean, the first 2 movements are very peaceful. The 3rd movement is kind of a joyful country dance, and then the only time you get this extreme turmoil in this piece is in the thunderstorm movement, which is a total contrast from the rest of the piece. It is fierce and ferocious, and there's thunder and lightning, and the trombones and timpani and piccolo have all been sitting there not playing at all until that movement, and then he brings in all these new voices, and the the thunderstorm effects are pretty amazing. And then what's curious is he repeats that same music as the storm is moving out. So you hear the same things, but getting quieter and quieter. And then even the last sort of thunder strike or lightning strike is very gentle. So then again, it ends in this, kind of shepherd hymn, shepherd dance. It's almost a little bit of yodeling in the distance. That was all pretty unusual for Beethoven to be that programmatic. He was definitely in the absolute music camp for most of his pieces.
Right. What you say about the thunderstorm is really interesting. So not only is it descriptive, but there's a spatial element, right? So at the first, you sort of hear the raindrops, and then you hear distant thunder, timpani, and then it moves closer, as you say, and then it moves away. So it is you can really imagine and just sit there and being enthralled by all of that what's happening. What's really fun about the third movement, the country dance. Apparently he, again, to his copyist, and I don't know if that's a totally reliable source, but there's quite a bit of humor in the third movement. The country dances you hear, sometimes they're not in sync, right? So the oboe and the bassoon that resemble sort of country instruments of that time, they're not really in sync, and then one comes in and the other one doesn't and catches up later as though they're like falling asleep, and then they're waking up, and then they come back together at the end. So there's quite a bit of humor, and it's not easy to play because musicians tend to line up automatically. So for this intended disarray, that's actually have to beat pretty clearly so people don't come in at the wrong time. It's really a fun piece, and then it ends, like you say, just sort of like it started, with peaceful, harmonious melodies, almost hymn-like.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Very joyful, very happy,
very joyful.
Thankful that the storm is past.
Would you say from a player's perspective that this is harder than some of the other symphonies, easier or different?
That's a good question. Compared to other Beethoven symphonies, mm-hmm. It's pretty long. So from a stamina point of view, it's we have to pace ourselves for that. I'd say for the most part, it might be a little bit easier than some of them. I'd say easier than the fifth, easier than the ninth. It's a good warm up for the ninth. But I will say that the storm movement is pretty difficult, especially for the lower strings, I think. But even for the violins, it just all of a sudden it goes really, really fast. And, we're all over the place, and we're jumping from a very low place in the violin to a high place. So that's difficult.
Yeah. Well, we forgot to mention that this is also the only Beethoven symphony in 5 movements, right? So that's unusual by itself. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to doing it. I've only done it twice before, so this will be interesting, and the first time in Holland during my time. So I'm really looking forward to doing that.
No, we're all looking forward to it. So, and we hope all of you who are still listening, are looking forward to it. And we do hope that this piece with an I will help you feel some sense of peace with an E and A as we share this with you on Saturday. Thanks so much for joining us. It's nice to have you along. We will be back with one of these talks in the spring. And we'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions at the concert and when we do this again next spring. So thank you so much. Thanks to Johannes and to Jack. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you.